Hello and welcome to Founders Unplugged. I am your host, Greg McCallum, also known as the Pay-As-You-Scale Commercial Advisor. Before we start, just wanted to let you know all these conversations are completely voluntary by the founders who are involved, so please give them some love. They're very busy individuals and they're taking up to 2 hours out of their day to come and sit and chat with me about themselves, about their businesses, and about all other kinds of stuff. Look in the description on whatever platform you're watching this and you will find links to them for their LinkedIn profiles and also the projects and the startups they're working on. So do go and check those out. And while you're at it, maybe give me a bit of love too. I do this as something on the side to my main business. I run a company called ThinkWork. And so if you're looking for any advice, I also do free commercial advice for those for up to 1 hour. That job allows me to do this. Thank you so much. Enjoy the episode. Please do show love and appreciation for them, and of course for this episode. If you enjoy it, like it, subscribe, share. Without further ado, I've talked long enough. Enjoy the episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Founders Unplugged, hosted by Greg McCallum.
Hey Greg, morning.
Hi, good morning, Daniel. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Do you prefer Gregory or Greg, by the way?
Either is fine, but Greg is shorter and easier to say, so maybe go with that.
All right.
Do you prefer Daniel or Dan?
Either's fine. Most people call me Daniel.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll stick with Daniel then. It feels more respectful. I don't know why.
Cool.
Oh, why is my note taker drawing? I don't want my note taker in here. Let's get rid of him. Bloody robot's taken over.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, how's things?
Yeah, not too bad. We've had good sort of good like growth of users over the last few months. So like we're pretty pleased with that. It's like sort of 20% growth month on month. So yeah, pretty pleased with that. Like it's really cool seeing how the internet works its magic, and people in random countries that you've never done any targeted marketing to suddenly start using what you've built. So that's that's kind of fun.
What's the most surprising country you've had users activate?
Let's have a look. So I should zoom in on the screen a bit. Yeah, so I mean, like US, like which kind of the strength of like how we've been taken up in the US despite not doing any marketing there is kind of interesting. And then also India and I think likewise the sort of African continent.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, these things spread. I mean, you know, I know for one, I speak to a lot of founders on a daily basis, and I recommend your platform all the time. And I think that's the way these things spread, right? Is people just recommend to one another, and it's a sort of somewhat viral capacity, right?
Yeah, I think being free helps a lot with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, fundraising founders rarely have lots of cash to go and deploy into like a license of tens of thousands of pounds or dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, look, we've kind of already jumped straight into it, but there is some sort of structure to this. Not very much, but kind of. So yeah, as you saw when you came in, we already started. So is it all right to show the screen share? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I won't edit that out. So look, the best way I find to start these things is to get my guests to introduce themselves and tell our audience a bit about themselves and what they do, and you know, maybe that's given a bit of a spoiler there, so that's fine. So yeah, if you don't mind, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do, and then we can get back to it and back to talking about it.
Sounds good. So yeah, I'm Daniel Sawko. I'm the CEO and co-founder of ShipShape.vc. So it's a free-to-use investor search engine, and what it does is it aggregates investor content and the investments that investors are making, and makes that free to search. So it's a bit, it's a bit like we think of ourselves as almost like a mini Google that's really specifically focused on helping founders basically save loads of time, because they can identify very quickly which investors really get what they're on about. And that kind of, I suppose we'll probably get into a bit more detail later on, but yeah, some of the searches that we get from founders are insane, and we learn every day about new technologies that we had no idea existed in the world. And that's probably one of the best bits of the job, actually, is learning that. How we came up with the idea, we kind of, well, I was working in the same company previously as Alistair, and the CEO had asked me, can you go and find which investors we should go speak with for our Series A? And that was really tough, really, really tough. I said yes, not really knowing what I was getting into, but it was quite early on. It might have been day 2. And so I thought, oh, this is just a research exercise. How hard can it be? And actually turns out that most startups are doing something that's pretty niche. And most investors, or most databases and lists that are out there, don't make it easy to find which investors are interested in your niche. And yeah, that business was doing a really very specific part of international tax compliance called FATCA and CRS, which are like two different tax regimes, and they're doing software in that space. So trying to find investors that are interested in that was
Right.
quite challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's a really interesting. So did you end up working with Alistair on that particular project? Hence why you then sort of span that off into what it is now, or was that did that involvement working on this together come a bit later on?
Yeah, so it came a bit later on. So Alistair joined about 6 months after I did.
Right.
But we did work together on that Series A. So we collaborated a lot on like things like the financial model, and also investor outreach and those communications, those conversations with investors, and that was, yeah, it was good. It was a good way to establish a working relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And so was it more that the idea came about as a result of going through that process, or were there some actual processes that you'd already put into place that you were like, wait a minute, if we were to take this out and scale this, was it a bit of both? So how did that come about?
So honestly, no. So I ended up leaving the business after just about a year,
right?
And I sort of burnt myself out, and it took some time for me to do some thinking about, okay, what have I learned? What do I want to do next? And I actually ended up doing a bit of consulting work for a US company called Fanmio, and they were raising, but the CEO was raising at a really high valuation, even for the market in sort of 2020. It was a really high valuation for where the business was at. But the CEO is a tremendous hustler. He is absolutely phenomenal, and he had somehow got half of a contract for a boxing match,
right,
between I think it's Logan Paul and Floyd Mayweather.
Wow. Okay.
So he had Logan Paul basically having agreed to do this fight, and the other person that was needed obviously was Floyd Mayweather.
Yeah.
And I realized at that point, one, it was really difficult to find investors again for that business. That it was they sort of doing like almost like cameo style, like celebrity interviews, like merch packages against that. But what was really obvious was actually the best way of financing that business wasn't necessarily via equity, equity via VC. It was actually to leverage the fact that they had something that could be potentially a massive asset, i.e. this fight, and own the rights to it.
Right.
So yeah, cut a long story short, I basically helped to structure a means of financing the deposit for Floyd Mayweather to sign on the dotted line so that fight could happen. And it was at that point where I was like, okay, right, this bit was the bit of finding VCs that were relevant to this company was way harder than this other form of finance. Actually, there needs to be a better way of founders identifying who might want to finance them and to fund their venture. And that's kind of what helped crystallize that. In addition to being in like South Wales during lockdown, and it's quite a deprived region of the UK. It's amazing beauty. There's some brilliant stuff happening in businesses there. And there were some really entrepreneurial, tech-driven responses to lockdown and to all the disruption that COVID caused at the time. Everything from pharmaceutical deliveries to your doorstep, to farm to fork programs where it was sort of making sure that the disruption that supermarkets were experiencing wasn't sort of translating to sort of lost income for farmers and also sort of lack of availability for consumers. But it's really obvious that these businesses didn't have access to the types of financial capital that might have enabled them to go national and then potentially international with that. And so that was almost like the moral driving force for wanting to do this and for wanting it to be free, for wanting founders to have access to the mission critical information that cuts down the time it takes to speak with relevant investors.
There almost is something quite democratic about what you've done as well in that sense, because you kind of touched on it there. You know, a lot of founders I speak to tell me that they're really struggling with networking because of where they live. You know, especially in the UK, you know, the general consensus is, you know, unless you live in London, you're not a proper founder, right? And I think that is slowly changing, thankfully. That it's not too based on geographical location. I certainly know investors care less and less about where you live. But in terms of being able to create the opportunities, right, being able to go to networking events and so on, if you're in some little village out, like you said, you know, in South Wales or, you know, or somewhere up north, you know, you don't exactly have an easy commute to the big city to take part in these events and find these very specific types of investors. This in some way democratizes that and enables you to go out and find those very specific people. And in some ways, I mean, makes it a lot simpler than having to speak to 100 people to find the one, right? You can just go straight to the one.
Yeah, I think that's, I think you really hit on something there. So if someone's living in Cardiff or Swansea or Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and they know that they need to come to London for a networking event, their cost, the sunk cost of going to an event is really high, whereas for a London founder, it's relatively low, and they can afford to roll the die multiple times on that. But actually, if you're a founder and you're away from the center of financial capital, one, obviously, it's great that VCs are deploying in a more geographically distributed way. I think the pandemic really helped sort of break the dam on that one. But networking is still really important. So if you are a founder outside of London, how do you make sure that the precious capital that you do have, that you're giving to like Great Western Railways or whatever it is, just to be able to go to London for an afternoon or an evening? How do you make sure that goes as far as it possibly can? That's something that we really
not to mention the all of the various charges for the pleasure of being in London as well.
Yes, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I love London, but I can understand why people choose to live elsewhere.
Likewise. I love London, but I understand why I don't live there very clearly. Exactly. But you're based in Cardiff, right?
Yeah, business is based in Cardiff. I actually live in West London. My wife has a desk job here, so that sort of keeps us here. But I'm up in Cardiff like once, twice a week. It's a great ecosystem, brilliant place to base a business. There's a really great ecosystem. You can navigate from one side of it to the other, within a few conversations and handshakes, which is something you can't really do in London. And so that size means that you've got ease of navigability from the different things that you might need, whether those are customers or potentially sources of capital as well, especially early stages.
And for anyone listening as well, we had your co-founder on not too long ago, in fact, a few weeks back on an episode, Alistair, and he's your CIO, I believe. Very interesting guy. We had a great chat about all sorts of things. I mean, tell me a bit more about that. Like, one of the things that I hear a lot of in what I do, and we see a lot of online, is talking about the importance of finding the right co-founder. You said that, sort of within 6 months of starting, you came across one another. How did you know it was a good fit? Or is it a good fit? Are you at each other's throats? Because it's a lot like a marriage, right? How did you know that it was the right circumstances and the right person to work with?
It's a really good question. I think there's we have different viewpoints. We solve problems in different ways, and as you will almost certainly have gleaned by speaking with Alistair for a little while, his mind works just at a different speed to everyone else's.
Yeah.
He is a supercomputer.
I'm convinced he has a quantum brain, not a biological one. Yeah.
That sounds about right. Yeah. So that actually works. So between us, that works really quite well. Where I'm quite deliberate and methodical. I like observing systems for a while before thinking, okay, here's how I would change it. And Alistair is really good at sort of executing multiple operations almost simultaneously and asking lots of questions about the way that something is working, should work, etc., etc. And between us, I think that works quite well. And we also, we're a business, we need to make money, but we also want to do good for the world. And that's something which I think really unites us and gets us through moments where, inevitably it is like a marriage. You do have difficult moments. You do have the need to almost like constantly renegotiate and readjust. And as long as you can do that playing from the same sort of rule book, that's fine. Like if your ethics and moral compass are aligned, then actually you can consistently go in and sort of say, I think that this is wrong. We should do it this way. And actually you can discuss objectively the merits or lack thereof of that particular proposal. We're quite dispassionate when we talk about things. We both think quite rationally, and I think that really helps in terms of the way that we assess situations and we assess the need for change.
That's a really interesting set of points you brought up there around sort of the alignment piece versus the areas in which you differ, because that is a difficult balance to strike, isn't it? And I think that is why the comparison of a marriage is brought up, because I think we all know, based on literature and based on what people say, that a good marriage should mean that you're both very much aligned with the end goal, which is to be happy and to have a flourishing family and all those things. As soon as the goal changes, then obviously or one person disengages from that goal or has goals that run counter to the main goal, then things go desperately wrong. But you can be very different people and it still works, because, and if anything, that if you complement each other and in filling the gaps of each other's weaknesses or complement each other's strengths, then that's an incredibly important way of an incredibly important dynamic. But all too often, I think you see the extremes of that, right, where you have two people who are so different that even their perceptions of the goal are actually not entirely aligned. That the vision isn't entirely the same, and I think that can be quite problematic. Or you just find I have encountered those founders or co-founders in the past who just believe that they can do it all and they don't need anyone else. And I think that is a large part of what causes a problem too. Is not recognizing, in fact, what you don't bring to the table. You're too focused on what you do.
Yes, couldn't agree more. That's a we both feel very lucky, I think. Put words in Alistair's mouth, but we both feel very lucky to have someone that is aligned, that we can sort of rely on as sort of support.
I got the impression he agrees with that sentiment.
Yeah,
no, don't worry.
not a miscry and get hauled up on later. So we're very, very lucky, I think, with that. It's one of the best decisions I think I've ever made in my life, I think.
Good. Well, I'm sure we'd be very happy to hear that. So I noticed that you studied in Oxford, is that right?
I did an Oxford FinTech program. So yes, it's
okay. That's my hometown. So good stuff. Yeah. Were you there? You were there for a year, I think. Is that how long the program?
It's a number of months. It's a several month program. Very much. It was relatively early days of UK FinTech, which I've always had. So ever since university back in 2010, I had my first role in a FinTech. And it wasn't even called FinTech back then. That's sort of how long ago it was. But yeah, it was a really interesting program. Some real experts and people and entrepreneurs that I really look up to, that were sort of delivering that course. And actually a VC who's based out in the US now, but used to be the head of corporate venture at what was then Thomson Reuters before it became Refinitiv. And it was a really good course to go through, and really, I think, along with you get a level of tuition and quality of education that is hard to replicate elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what it's known for, right? Yeah. What did you make of Oxford itself as a city? I mean, we call it a city, but it's not technically a city. But what did you make of Oxford City itself?
Yeah, so that's actually where my wife and I met. So she was doing her master's there.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, Oxford will always be very special from that perspective, as well as from an educational perspective. So
sure.
It's a great place to be, and if you can spend some time there, ideally, whilst I think obviously going there as a tourist is very interesting, and if you get an experience of what it's like to live there, and if you get a little bit of the student experience, whether that's because you're paying for a course and going there to study properly, or just because you've got very close friends there, I would thoroughly recommend having an insider's view of it rather than going there as a tourist. Not least because the pavements just can't cope with the number of tourists that are there. So.
Yeah, they really can't. Yeah, and it's multi-layered. Well, I mean, I suppose like most places, if you go there on a surface level as a tourist, you're only going to sort of scratch the surface of things, and there's a lot more underneath, like with most places. But Oxford is definitely a bit of a treasure trove of a cultural hot pot of experiences and things to explore. It's it's not necessarily too obvious from an outside observer until you sort of, like you said, actually really start experiencing it. For sure. So was your wife from Oxford originally? Is she an Oxfordian?
So she is not from there originally. She's actually from just outside Swansea, which is the reason for my being in lockdown in South Wales. So yeah, that's where she grew up. So yeah, she was. Alas, no. Yeah,
fair enough. Well, that's a lot of I know of a lot of very nice love stories that have occurred due to Oxford meetups. It is a place where a lot of people from all around the world meet, and that's one of the things I love about it. Is that just the diversity of it, it's very different from the kinds of the kind of sort of cultural diversity that you find in a lot of other places. I find it's way more I don't even know how to describe it, but I think you know what I mean, right? You can go to London and you can say that it's very diverse, and very culturally mixed place, but it feels like it's so big that naturally what happens is these little pockets start to form, and it's actually not particularly mixed in a lot of places. Whereas Oxford really is. You go to a pub, you sit down, and you will have a group of people. One person from Korea, another person from France, another person from Italy. Like it is just absolute insanity, and it's amazing. Like I love everything about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And there's there's a level of, I think this is really important. I know there's been some level of there are certain movements in the West that perhaps would result in a lack of cerebral diversity. But I think one of the really powerful things about places like Oxford, like Cambridge, is the fact that you do have people from different walks of life, from different cultures coming together, and actually that there is a cerebral diversity in the way that solutions are tackled. And that's another thing that I think over the what feels like a lifetime, but is actually only coming up to 3 years now, the fact that even internally we have diverse means of thinking about problems and come from different backgrounds. That diversity of thought is ultimately what has enabled us to it almost feels like cheating at times, some of the simple inventions and additions and innovations that are made just by having that level of thinking internally. And I think, places like Oxford, the reason for their success is ultimately bringing together people who think differently, rather than in a very mono-computational
And you're absolutely right, because that example I gave of, you go to a pub or a restaurant, you end up, surrounded by different people. Equally, like some of the best, conversations I've ever had have been with just absolute strangers, which you can engage in very meaningful conversation with absolute strangers and be like, all right, well, that was really lovely. 5 hours of my life. Lovely to meet you. I'm going to go about my day now. And you've just literally, touched on some of the main, some really interesting topics that you probably never talk about ever again. It's wonderful experience. I do need to go back there. I don't go back there nearly enough. I'm getting excited just thinking about it.
Yeah.
Even my Oxford accent is starting to come out now. Can you tell? It's I'm starting to enunciate a little bit more clearly. But look, let's go back to ShipShape. So because I'm a huge fan of it. And I think it's something that is really, really needed. Especially as we're seeing such an insane rise. Oh, my doorbell's gone. Of course it has. This is the perfect timing. Someone else can deal with it. But no, and I don't know if you'd agree with this sentiment. Perhaps you can tell me. But I do feel like everyone and their mum has a startup these days, right? So the competition is at an all-time high, and I think we are seeing that as a bit of a knock-on effect from lockdown and the virus that shall not be named and so on, where a lot of people took the plunge into entrepreneurship and becoming a founder. So it's a really interesting time for it. I think it's very much needed. Are you a sort of was that sort of factored in to some degree in why you decided to put together ShipShape, or really was it sort of more of this perfect storm of necessity versus sort of you seeing an idea, like you mentioned, about how it catalyzed? Was there much sort of thought put into that? Or?
So I quite like thinking about things on a relatively macro level.
Right.
So in the West, growth rates are relatively speaking significantly lower than they were even 60, 70 years ago. Because a lot of economic low-hanging fruit has gone. And what that means is that governments are really likely in the long run to give more and more support to the types of innovations that enable growth to happen. And so therefore are shifting away from, we want to build a textile workshop into, well, how do we split water into releasing hydrogen in a way that's effective, that can then power the next sort of potential manufacturing revolution, or almost going to a different level. And I think one of the other really interesting things that has also occurred, even in the last decade, is that we've gotten better at testing hypotheses and disproving the need for a business sooner, which means that you don't use as much capital in order to do it. And if you think about things,
why is that, do you think? Why have we got better at that?
Failure.
Right.
When you rack up enough failures and enough people observe those failures, and also I think that there was actually, I can't remember where the article was. There was an article recently about founders that follow the scientific method, i.e., like following a method of testing hypotheses, are more likely to succeed. And I actually think that they're probably more likely to just realize failure sooner rather than carrying on with the absence of evidence. And that is something that means that capital allocation is more wasteful. I think also those who are allocating capital are taking better steps to de-risk the allocation of that capital, even down at like an angel level. More angels are wanting to see basic hygiene factors. And again, going back 6-7 years, I don't think that there was the same level of standardized, where's your data room? Have you got a financial model? Like these just basic questions. I don't think that they necessarily were as ubiquitous, but they organically have become standards that people expect to adhere to. And therefore there's a network-based filter for whether or not actually an idea is worth funding.
So what you're saying is, in some ways, that the very nature of the fact that due to a mixture of reasons, we've now got investors being a lot more stringent in the areas in which they, the data that they require, the need to see traction and all that is in some ways kind of shaping the natural evolutionary landscape of the startup ecosystem. That it's acting as something of a filter, essentially, to not let bad ideas go on for longer than they need to some degree.
Correct. Yes, I think we'll continue to get better at that. What I think is really interesting is the growth in no-code and low-code solutions, and the ability to simulate computationally physical things too. So, AI making breakthroughs in sort of drug and vaccine development would previously have required physical things and the throughput of tens of thousands of different variations of compositions of drugs, etc. That these advances have drastically reduced the barrier of cost to progress, and even things like ChatGPT, for example. What I'm really excited about is how many more businesses become possible because there's a reasonably intelligent AI that you can task with certain tasks. Granted, you've got to give it instructions like a toddler, but there's almost not quite human capable, but there's an assistant there that's capable of doing lots of tasks for you, and that's exciting.
But it is absolutely. But it's interesting because what my sort of takeaway from that is something I've been mulling on for a while anyway, which is that essentially that it's a reactive response, like almost an immune response from those that have the money to, like I touched on a minute ago, the fact that everyone and their mother has a startup. And what I mean by that is I think it's accelerated by innovation within the startup ecosystem, that it's very easy to emulate the appearance of having an innovative venture, right? Easier than ever. You have the tools, there's the knowledge, there's a lot of access to information as anyone who wants to become an entrepreneur, to take a potentially quite bad idea and build something around it that gives the illusion that is innovative or interesting. And whereas, a few years ago, that would have maybe slipped under the radar and actually managed to get funding and probably be essentially on life support for a long time. Now the immune response is finding that quicker, perhaps, and it's sort of catching up a little bit and preventing that from happening as much. But I wonder, that's probably going to be quite a continuous battle within the startup ecosystem, right? As things innovate on both sides of that fence.
Yeah, I
that makes sense.
It does, and I think there are some.
A lot of this, by the way, is me. Sorry to interrupt, but a lot of this, by the way, is me just coming up with the things that I haven't necessarily fully formed, and I'm just sort of getting it out there because it's interesting. And so, if it doesn't make any sense, just tell me.
No, I think it does make sense, and I think so. You get VC hype trends of what they want to throw money into, and generative AI being the latest of a series, and I would posit that it's a better place to throw money at than like funding monkey JPEGs. Like,
I mean, there is a reason for it. It's not being done arbitrarily. Like there is a legitimate reason for it, which I don't think those that aren't in that space fully understand.
Yeah, but to your point, are others trying to copy and stitch together a bunch of off-the-shelf things and then say that they're AI businesses in the hope that means that additional capital gets thrown their way? Of course, but I think this is something that's going to be so ubiquitous that it's kind of like saying, oh yeah, we use electricity in our business. It's going to be part of the course, and ultimately, over the long run, such methods of trying to obtain capital just aren't going to work. And you still need to solve a problem at the end of the day. Like, anyone can electricity into something and not generate something useful out of it. If you can use it to generate something useful and you can do it better than others, then you've got a business.
Right. And that is what it comes down to. Absolutely. I'm sure at some point, saying that electricity, is factored into your business was probably a, part of the gold rush. That was like probably the AI equivalent now. Like, really? Oh, well, take all my money.
Well, I mean, so yeah, I think there was if you look at the turn of the turn 19th century, you had a chief electricity officer.
Right. Yeah, we should bring that back. I think we should bring that back.
Yeah, I mean, like, but it was because it was so important to the running of these businesses.
Yeah.
A bit like 10, 15 years ago, chief data officer was an absolute requirement at board level.
Yeah.
And so we will go through these phases where these technologies are so important that there's got to be representation at the highest level in the company.
It maybe the newest executive position will be chief prompt officer.
Something like that, yeah. Like
I quite like that.
It's really important. And actually, a lot of time, so our data science team, they get a fair bit of time to experiment and sort of hack around. And a fair amount of that time has gone into prompt engineering for obtaining the results that we need to get in order to add levels of usefulness to the data that we get, and then presenting that back to our users so that they can basically make better decisions.
Yeah. Do you sorry, going really sort of in a left turn here, but do you think we're in a recession currently?
In real terms, yes. And what I mean by that is, are we getting poorer? And I think
on an individual level, as a country.
Both. Yeah, but on both levels, we're getting poorer.
Right.
We printed a lot of money during COVID, and we also, via furlough, we expanded the money supply, and continued paying people salaries for fewer goods and services that were then produced because people weren't working as much, and therefore you've got more money chasing fewer goods and services, and that has a knock-on effect. And so I'm not surprised to see inflation where it is, and that inflation is obviously eroding individual and national prosperity. Yeah.
What would you and look, I'm not suggesting with this question that you're maybe you're a politician or an economist or anything, but what would you say are some of the things that can be done to tackle that from at least your vantage point?
I mean, we've got to have a very serious think about, I think, property in particular in this country. And you look at someone walks into £1 million in the UK, they don't think, oh, I want to back 50 tech businesses and I'll get potentially a really good return on that. I think you need to have a reasonable portfolio and a portfolio-based approach in terms of risk, but we have an obsession with property. And beyond providing a roof over someone's head, it's not contributing that much. And because we're not building many houses, you're essentially acting as a rent seeker. So you are saying, I'm going to capture some of the network that isn't growing, and I'm going to basically derive income from another person's salary. And granted, you're providing notionally a service by putting a roof over their head, but you're also crowding out people that do need properties. And the long run effect of that is people don't live where they should be living. Other people continue to think that putting all of their life savings into property is a really good thing and not allocating it elsewhere. And so if you look at everything from the balance sheets of big banks in this country to the way that the Treasury earns quite a lot of income from inheritance tax, there are a lot of vested interests that don't want property prices to go down, but we are literally killing off and crowding out capital allocation to other parts of the economy that actually will make us more prosperous. Because the world doesn't need another buy-to-let landlord. The world does need another 20 unicorns, making a genuine difference, and also ensuring prosperity occurs. And I was lucky enough to be at a roundtable a couple of years ago with Andrew Bailey, Governor of Bank of England. And whilst I completely disagree that inflation has been caused by people asking for pay rises, I think it has been caused by the Bank of England getting trigger happy with the printing press. He did raise a really interesting point, which is, and as a point of the discussion, was software is quite deflationary, and automating things is also deflationary, because something that required a very high input cost, took a lot of resource previously, is now being done for a fraction of that price, and with competition, the price drops for things like compute power, for example. That's a fraction of what it did 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, all innovation is deflationary, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have really good deflationary effects that are non-deleterious. You can just buy more services, like your time being freed up because you have a dishwasher or a washing machine is something that is just net beneficial in terms of the value of the human time that was freed up.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the, and I know we're sort of really going off tangent here, but it's a really interesting area to explore. But how did that roundtable come about? So how did that come about?
The what? Sorry.
The roundtable you were mentioning there. How did that come about?
There's an innovation centre in Cambridge called St John's. St John's Innovation Centre. So it's part of St John's College. They work with a few entrepreneurs, and just via networking and that innovation centre being interested in our search engine, we're invited along to that. Which led to a couple of really, one of the really cool things that came out of that is our search engine being used by the Cambridge Judge Business School MBA and venture capital program, where actually the students in that program are basically tasked with, here's your business, it's doing something specific, go and find which investors we should speak with. And so basically gets them to walk through in a practical way the difficulties that an entrepreneur might go through in identifying sources of capital and going through that process of, okay, who do I want to speak with and why?
Oh, that's great. That's a really nice use case. Well, it's a great use case, isn't it? I noticed you I do want to come back to something about property you mentioned in a minute, but I noticed you and Alistair both use the term search engine a lot when talking about ShipShape, which I think is really important, right? Because Alistair kind of explained why you referred to it that way, and I think you kind of did at the beginning. But really briefly, before we go back to the property thing, can you qualify that? What's so important? Because I understand it's a very important part of the vision for ShipShape. So what is so important about referring to ShipShape as a search engine, as opposed to any other term that we probably see some variants of already out in the marketplace?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a difference between maintaining a database in which you can run structured queries against. So if you look at Crunchbase is a database. The people who can enter data into that database are basically anyone on the planet, and that database is updated by people going in, they're editing their profile. There's often not a means of, but you have potentially misaligned incentives. So if you're a business and you're a tech business, you could lie that you raised a certain amount of money, for example. And unless there's
really, you can do that? I didn't realize all this time.
Yep.
Could have. Yeah. So many missed opportunities. Damn it. Never mind.
Yeah. And then you can, and then you also, the way that you search through it, the way that you extract results is you have to structure queries. It's not that you don't query a search engine, but you've got to basically preset a load of filters. And then I think crucially, databases are very often not semantically searchable. So you could type in sort of like biofilm for wound healing into our search engine. And even if there's not an exact match for that precise search phrase, we will semantically point you to things that sound like it.
Right.
But you cannot do that as easily in a database. In fact, usually what you've got to do is you've got to use preset categorizations of the types of entries in that database in order to look through it, which is where you end up with a huge problem on a marketing perspective or a marketing intelligence perspective if you're a founder or if you're an investor, because a fintech founder isn't actually a fintech founder. Sorry, they are a fintech founder, but what they're doing isn't just fintech. They will be doing some type of, like, I don't know, open banking, infrastructure technology, or like something to do with FX. They could be doing a whole range of things that actually sit in a far more specific area underneath that sort of that grand term. But if you can,
it's like Alistair mentioned, he said that he's not a fan of SIT codes for that exact reason, that these categories are just way too broad and aren't helpful in the these sort of situations, because they're far too big an umbrella. Like you said, there's a lot more nuance to what a business actually does day to day.
Yeah, and these categorizations make sense for something that doesn't change very much. So having sort of postcodes or areas of London, that makes sense. Like tagging an area, like categorizing an area of London as being like Brixton, that makes sense. It's not going to change. It's not going to change, and if it does change, it's not going to change very much. Like, you might have some boundary reform like once every 30, 40 years, but like beyond that, it doesn't really happen very often. Whereas if you're dealing with an area that by definition is changing all the time, if we think about innovation, like there are new breakthroughs happening all the time. Is a tag used to categorize an entire area 20 years ago still going to be relevant today? Is it going to be helpful to people needing? Is it going to be helpful for people who want to find something really important quickly? And the answer to that increasingly becomes no, because if you've only got a fixed number of categories, but you've got an increasing number of points you need to reference, the relative usefulness of those categorizations drops with time. And so,
makes sense. Yeah, I was going to ask another question about the property thing, but we've only got an hour because I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So I want to try and use this hour as wisely as possible. So I'm really interested to understand what advice you would be giving to founders currently. And I know this is a very commonly asked question for CEOs, especially in your space, but I think it's a very important one, because like we've touched on, it is a very difficult point right now for businesses for a whole range of reasons that we've very loosely alluded on. Maybe another time we can delve into a bit more if we have a bit more time. But I'd be very curious to get your perspective. You're obviously very privy to an enormous set of data at the moment, which I understand you're adding new features on. I saw a post recently, for example, about the insights that you're hoping to provide a few months down the road as to whether or not investors are actually deploying investments and so on. Really interesting potential new feature, and a lot of other things you're working on. So given that quite unique vantage point that you're at, are you able to provide any insight, advice, tips to founders out there currently looking to raise, aside from the obvious, which is use ShipShape, which they absolutely should be doing, by the way.
That's a really good question. So I think doing research is a really good way of leveling the playing field for a conversation with an investor. Ultimately, founders put themselves very often at a disadvantage with an investor by not having researched them. And that means that you're starting off on the back foot in those conversations. And starting off on the back foot in those conversations is something of a warning, to the investor that you're displaying behavioral characteristics that mean that you're not going to be as likely to sell equity to someone else in future for a higher price, which is ultimately all that that investor cares about. They want to see your ability to sell the equity that they're buying today for more tomorrow. And if your behavioral traits don't align with that view, then you're going to be making things quite difficult for yourself.
Interesting. I mean, in some ways, to break it down to really simple terms that I think we can all understand, in the same ways that you would prepare for any interview, right? You wouldn't go into an interview for a job unless you've done, for certain jobs anyway, unless you've done your due diligence on the company that you're looking to hopefully work with. And would you say that also serves a purpose beyond even just that, but or maybe in a bit more of a simplistic way, in terms of just being able to make a meaningful human connection through interaction, because you have something to connect with, something to talk about, that actually just gets a relationship off to a good start, right?
Yeah, I think that's it, right? You're looking for areas that you align on. And if you don't research, you won't know that you went to the same school, or that, for example, Oxford might be a special place for the other person in the conversation too. So I think, as very well demonstrated, just by looking at my LinkedIn, you saw that I had some sort of connection to Oxford, and therefore we had a conversation around that, and that really helped.
I've actually been following you around for a month without you knowing. So I when I research, I don't just go on LinkedIn. That's a very lazy way of researching. I actually follow each of my guests around in a car for a month and make notes of what they're doing.
No, but I think that type of research, and this is for a 1 hour podcast, and granted there'll be effort and time after it, but we're not talking here necessarily about investments numbering into the hundreds of thousands. But if you were to engage in a conversation that was to do with those types of numbers, actually doing research on who your counterparty is going to be is just common sense. And that's I think the biggest advice that I could give to founders is do your research. We have been burned previously by not. I don't know if we were engaged with a family office that was setting up a fund, supposedly. It never happened.
Right.
And we at the time didn't have access to data that one way or the other should have suggested we do more diligence. And that's one of the reasons why we really want to the post I put up.
You did mention in that post that you had experienced something similar to that before, so that's presumably what you were referring to.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm not saying that there can't be new funds with no track record. There are all the time. But it just means that you need to have a certain level of additional diligence into another fund's activities. Who knows the person in the fund or the people in the fund? Like, what do they think of them as individuals, as characters? Have they ever sort of co-invested? Has money changed hands before? Has there been a commercial relationship before that you can really delve into? And I think by providing evidence of the absence of evidence, you therefore know whether or not you should ask additional questions.
And I think the benefits of what you're suggesting here are threefold. Aside from the sort of social positives of that, being able to have positive interaction, finding common ground, demonstrating the skill set that is most desirable. But then the third, which is I think that the psychological one, which is as a founder, especially first-time founders, very nervous going into a lot of these interactions, and they're often asking, what should I do to prepare? How do I quell the nerves? And I think actually just spending a bit of time, like you said, to do this research can help in the feeling of being psychologically prepared to enter into these conversations. That in fact that you feel like you've done something in order to prepare. Even just doing something minimal can have that effect, a calming effect, to let you feel I'm ready for this interaction. I'm ready for this meeting. I've done my due diligence on it. And due diligence, like you very rightly pointed out here, isn't just in the hands of the investor, which is often the perception that, more often than not, they haven't done any due diligence in these, especially early on. Like, that's the point, right, of them wanting to speak with you, is they want you to tell you about them. And they're sometimes having, hundreds of these meetings a week. So they don't have the time. So, but at least that's my 10 cents there. I think it can help from that perspective too. Just in the same way of, before going into an interview, like to go back to that, or an exam, or something, just knowing that you've actually done a bit of studying can make you feel a little bit more relaxed when you're in that situation, right?
Yeah, I think that then carries through to what the chances are of a successful conclusion to that interaction.
Absolutely.
Because, if you sense that the power imbalance is wrong, both parties will likely edge away.
Mm-hmm.
And if they, and therefore, that then has a huge impact on that then should serve as a really clear message for founders that actually, if you go in well researched, it will be a much more level playing field, and it becomes a much more human conversation,
right?
And thinking about aligning interests, it doesn't seem totally out of whack. Like you are literally in there to align interests. And if you have a misperception, or if your perception of their relative strength is wrong, then you're unlikely to be able to align interests in a way that makes sense for both parties.
Yeah, really good advice. Really good advice. Is there anything else you would add to the advice you provide, or is that your main headline, your main takeaway that people should be latching onto?
Just keep hustling. Like
keep hustling.
Yeah. if you can make something happen today that you'd normally put off to tomorrow, then you start making marginal gains that stack up over time. Like do that LinkedIn post, even if you're not quite happy with it. Like go to that event, even if you're a bit nervous. And it's amazing how kind of get long tail effects. So like be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you never know where help will come from. And if you're front of mind with people, you're much more likely to generate positive momentum for yourself. So I suppose just get much like the podcast, right? Getting started, and like I think Harry Stebbings with 20-minute VC, like they did a few hundred before they even started getting any type of significant traffic.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, and it's advice that I'm very often giving to first-time founders, which is, it's noisy out there. First of all, you need practice in building your confidence. So what's the best thing to do? Put yourself out there. Just keep putting yourself out there. Like you said, even if it's rubbish, no one likes the content they first put out, but you've got to put it out because of, like you said, you'll be front of mind. There's nothing better than situations when you sit down with an investor and they go, wait a minute, I reckon you've been in my feed for the last, and I say, yes. It's, oh, I love your videos, or I love your content. That's the situation you want to be in, ideally. You want to be somewhat known to them.
Yeah, the number of conversations I have now where it's like, oh yeah, I see your LinkedIn stuff. It's like, okay, I have no idea who you are, but you feel like you know me. This is a great way of starting off an interaction. I mean, LinkedIn is literally the online, networking platform for professionals. It is a huge room where, thousands, millions of professionals are networking. So you don't necessarily need to be able to, have the access to a networking event. You've got one on your computer, on your phone. So, you've got to leverage it. The only problem with that is it's not a room full of 100 people. It's a room full of millions. So you need to make some noise to be seen and heard, right? So we're in agreement on that piece of advice for sure.
I think the other thing I was just going to say was
that marketing message, the neat synopsis of what it is that you're doing, will be potentially hundreds of iterations away, and that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, everything is potentially hundreds of iterations away, really, when you're early stage, right? But that is a really important, that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Really good advice that, it's not always nailed straight off the bat, is it? And that can be, I think that can be quite disheartening for a lot of founders. I know I've been in that position too. And in some ways, like, I'm working on a startup now, and we're in that process now of, finding how do we know the value, but how do we nail that, in a sentence? How do we really make that clear? How do we blow people's socks off in the same way that we do? And it's very difficult to do when you're in it, day in, day out. You can sometimes struggle to see the forest for the trees. You understand it intrinsically, what it does and the problem it solves, but actually explaining that to someone else concisely, especially on a platform, platforms that remove context, is a very difficult thing to achieve, isn't it?
Indeed. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So you just got to keep doing it. That's your advice. Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
Good advice. Yeah. Keep doing it. If it doesn't work, survival of the fittest, right? Get rid of it, decommission it, make it extinct, bring in the new ones, and keep iterating. That's the way to do it. Well, look, I know our time's up, and look, I think we could easily talk for way longer. Which to be honest, even when we do the full 2-hour ones, like, we end up sort of being like, really, it's 2 hours already? So we'll definitely have to do this again if you're ever able to. I know how busy you are.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe we'll meet in person sometime soon as well if I'm up your way. It would be great to catch up and continue this conversation.
Great. That'd be amazing. Would really like that. Really enjoyed speaking with you, and thanks for having me.
Likewise. Thank you again so much for being on. And for anyone listening, go check out ShipShape. All of your, the links to your profile and the website, everything will be there with the video and the description and the audio and everything like that. So thank you. I'll let you carry on with your day. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Greg. You too. And have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching and/or listening. Please like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments below.